All of her adult life, Christine carried something inside her that she never dared to express, not to the cameras, not to the sister wives, and not even to the children who loved her more fiercely than anyone realized. It lived quietly inside her, shaping her choices, tightening her voice in certain conversations, and lingering behind her smile during moments that looked calm on the surface but felt turbulent beneath. Viewers assumed they knew the fullness of Christine's inner world, since they watched snippets of her life play out on television. They never saw the quiet parts, the pieces she swallowed before they could escape, the emotions she buried because she feared what speaking them out loud might destroy. There is a difference between being honest and being fully known. Christine had learned that early. She told the truth as best she could, but there were layers of her experience that felt too delicate, too painful, or too destabilizing to share. She learned to protect not only herself but the entire family by choosing silence. She carried her secret like a folded letter tucked somewhere inside her chest, so carefully hidden that even she sometimes forgot how much weight it held until something pressed down on it again. The family dynamic demanded her constant warmth, her constant patience, her constant belief in a lifestyle that did not always return the same energy. She was the one who smoothed rough edges, who kept schedules running, who offered comfort after arguments, who softened tension even when she wasn't the cause of it. And because she played that role so consistently, people assumed she could carry anything, that she was unbreakable, that she didn't need the same emotional support she spent her life giving. But Christine felt everything, more deeply than anyone knew. She felt every single moment that she was overlooked. She felt every dismissal that slipped out during conversations. She felt it each time it was the case that one wasn't chosen when she should have been. Over the years, she learned to keep these feelings locked behind a well-practiced smile, because to voice them was to threaten the fragile peace she tried to maintain inside an already complicated home. She didn't want to be a source of conflict. She didn't want to be one of those dramatic, needy women. She didn't want her children sensing the cracks she worked hard to cover. So she just pushed everything inward. She absorbed pain quietly. She held back her tears at moments when she should have cried openly. She kept herself small so others could feel comfortable. And slowly, the secret she carried grew heavier, not because it was scandalous or shocking, but because it was deeply human. Christine had been afraid of admitting that she had never felt truly loved the way she needed. She had been scared to say out loud that she felt like the outsider in her own marriage, even when standing inside the same room. She was afraid to let him in on the fact that her heart had been breaking long before the world could see the fractures. And she was terrified that maybe, just maybe, if she spoke her truth, everything around her would come crumbling down. Her marriage, friendships, family structure, and even her identity. So she kept quiet. She lived through moments that were emotionally draining, as she told herself this was sacrifice, and a sacrifice was noble. Patience was a virtue, and the results would eventually change if she simply kept showing up with hope, loyalty, and good intentions. But silence carves into a person. It changes posture, it changes expression, it changes how a person sees themselves. Christine began to shrink emotionally, not because she wanted to, but because she felt that was the only route to peacekeeping. The more she held inside, the harder it became to imagine a life where one could speak openly with fear of misunderstanding or dismissal. Her children noticed the small shifts. They noticed when she grew quiet during certain conversations, when her smiles became shorter, and when she didn't defend herself anymore during moments when clearly she should have. But they would not understand it all until later. They only knew that their mother was carrying something heavy, a heaviness she never explained because she didn't want them to grow up feeling divided. For years, she kept telling herself that silence was strength, that to endure discomfort was part of a wife's role in the family, and emotional sacrifice was expected. But deep inside, she knew the truth she was concealing had begun to break her. She knew she could no longer pretend everything was fine when her heart felt increasingly fragile. The pressure grew gradually, moment by moment. Public conversations dealing with loyalty, internal conversations about fairness, emotional negotiations that left her drained, and the unspoken truth she had never shared with the family became a shadow that followed her everywhere, through holidays, through discussions about the future, through moments when she tried to be playful but felt too wounded to fully participate. It didn't come with a dramatic argument. It didn't come with shouting or accusations. It came softly, as silently as her secret had grown. It came with the realization that she could no longer betray herself by continuing to remain silent. She could no longer continue pretending that hiding her truth was a way of protecting her family. And before she ever spoke it aloud, Christine had to admit it to herself. She had to confront that part of herself that had been neglected all these years. She had to acknowledge the pain that she had minimized. She had to address the emotional truth that had been buried so deep inside that even she was afraid to touch. The one thing she had never told the family wasn't an event or a scandal. It was a feeling. The feeling that she had spent years in a marriage where her emotional needs were never met, where she felt invisible, where she felt unimportant, where she felt unloved in ways that slowly drained the joy from her life. Christine didn't wake up one day and decide to keep her truth hidden. Silence settled in over time, shaped by years of emotional negotiation, small disappointments, and difficult realities that she didn't know how to express without risking everything she valued. She had entered plural marriage with sincerity and faith, believing deeply in the principles she was raised with. She believed in unity, in shared responsibility, in support between wives, and in the idea that love could stretch far enough to hold everyone. But while the structure may have worked for others, Christine began to feel its weight long before she ever admitted it to herself. They were early moments, small ones that seemed insignificant, which nonetheless spoke to the emotional gap growing between her and the rest of the family. Moments when she would voice a concern but feel unheard. Moments when she needed reassurance but practicality came instead of comfort. And moments when she wanted connection and distraction came. Individually, these were not the big things, but collectively they etched quiet, hidden places of loneliness within her heart. She swallowed those feelings, convinced they were temporary. She reminded herself that families go through phases of turmoil. She felt that loyalty required bearing discomfort without moping. And for years, surviving became her norm. What made it even heavier on her to keep silent was the fear of how her truth would be received. She had been afraid that articulating her needs would make her sound ungrateful. She feared the other wives would misunderstand her vulnerability as jealousy. She was also concerned that her children would feel a sense of instability and insecurity. And probably above all, she was concerned that her husband would view her honesty as criticism and not as a plea for connection. So she held back. She pushed her feelings deeper, telling herself it was the right thing she was doing. But with each suppression of emotion, it added another layer to the quiet burden she carried. In time, the burden became one with which she couldn't speak. Not because she didn't want to, but because she no longer knew where to start. Plural marriage required cooperation. It required compromise. But it also required emotional equality. And Christine slowly, painfully began to realize that rarely inside her own marriage did she feel equal. She felt like she existed on the edges, present, needed, but rarely centered. Years went by, and the strain on her heart increased. There were times when she attempted to express her truth indirectly. She would say that she felt lonely. She would tell him that she desired more intimacy. She would express frustration over feeling overlooked. But none of these ever landed as she had hoped. Her vulnerability met resistance time and again. Explanations were given instead of compassion. Solutions were offered instead of comfort. She didn't want to fix a problem. She wanted to feel loved. Her silence grew thicker with each failure. She was afraid to be called emotional. She was afraid not to be understood. She was afraid to be told that she was overreacting. And because this was more frightening to her than what was hurting her, she continued to bury her truth. Her children saw only parts of this. They would see her sadness after tense discussions, never the root of it. They saw her retreat into quiet when she felt overwhelmed, but not the storm behind her eyes. They would see her wipe the tears away quickly and pretend it was nothing, thinking she was protecting them from emotional instability. Christine thought that by hiding her truth, she could save the stability of the family. But in fact, she let silence breed distance. Distance between her and her husband, between her and the other wives, and between her and herself. The following years were some of the most difficult emotional times of her life. She found herself waiting for affection that rarely came. She found herself stepping aside so others could receive attention, while she convinced herself she could handle the emptiness. She watched herself grow small in rooms where once she felt vibrant. All the while she kept up appearances of strength. She cooked for all of them. She took care of the children. She supported birthdays, holidays, and milestones. She even laughed, though her eyes felt heavy. Inside, she harbored a secret she was too guilty to speak, a secret that whispered, "I'm not loved the way I need to be." And that whisper grew louder over time. The breaking point began a long time before
She was simply exposing the truth that had never been voiced to the family, that she was disconnected not because she didn't love them, but because she simply hadn't felt loved in ways she needed. What made her confession so powerful was in its vulnerability. It is much easier to state intellectual needs. Emotional needs are the most challenging to express because they expose the deepest parts of us. They require admission to oneself and others that one has been in pain in ways difficult to quantify. Christine wasn't talking about facts or events, but an internal world, one she had protected for years out of fear that no one would understand. Her honesty brought stillness into the room. Not anger, not chaos, not defensiveness, only silence. The kind of stillness that occurs when finally somebody says out loud what their heart has been whispering for years. She had not spoken out, she said, because she did not want to break up the family. She did not want her children to feel torn. She did not wish to seem unappreciative, and she did not want the world to make a show of her private anguish. But the silence had grown too much for her to bear, and silence, she now saw, was not saving the family, it was destroying her. She spoke about her guilt for having needs in the first place, how she had convinced herself that wanting emotional connection was selfish, how she had translated lack of attention into a flaw within herself, not a sign of imbalance. She had internalized so much that the confession felt like lifting layers off her chest, layers she hadn't realized were suffocating her until they were finally named. It was not a judgment on anyone else's decision. It was not an indictment. It was just her. Every feeling she might have had for herself was suppressed for years because she did not feel she had the right to them. and the emotional suppression had reached a breaking point that was no longer tolerable. It was the family's reaction, not shock, but confusion, then realization. Some understood her immediately, others needed time, but everyone felt the weight of what she had said, especially her children. Her kids never blamed her for staying silent. They never questioned her strength. They had seen glimpses of her pain, even if she tried to hide it. They had never known how deep it went, but they recognized the exhaustion behind her smile. They recognized how often she disappeared into herself after difficult moments. They recognized the long stretches where she seemed to be present physically but distant emotionally. Now they knew why. In an instant, her revelation connected the dots between years of minor moments. Quiet sighs, unfinished sentences, held breath. The confession didn't make them angry, it made them protective. To them, everything else paled in significance compared to their mother's emotional reality. Christine had spent so long worrying that telling the truth would fracture the family. Instead, it did something else entirely, brought clarity. Her confession wasn't about the end of marriage, about division. It was about naming that emotional emptiness she had been carrying around. It gave her the clarity to name it back and find herself again. She remembered that she wasn't just a wife, not only a mother, not only a participant in a lifestyle. She was a woman who had needs and feelings, dreams and limits. It was her truth that set her free. She no longer felt obliged to show that she was contented when she was not, to fake a facade of emotional strength when this was brittle, and to minimize her feelings for the sake of harmony. For the first time, she let herself be. What surprised her most, however, was not the reaction of the family, but her reaction. She felt lighter, steadier, clearer. She had dreaded this moment for years. She had rehearsed worst-case scenarios in her head. She had imagined conflict, disappointment, judgment. She found, on the contrary, a kind of quiet inside that she had never known. She realized that the truth doesn't destroy what is real. It only destroys what is built upon silence. Her confession changed the emotional landscape of everything to come. It redefined how the family viewed her. It redefined how she viewed herself. And it redefined the question she had been too much afraid to ask. What might her life look like if she chose to put herself first and not sacrifice her emotional well-being? In that question lay the beginning of Christine's transformation. Her truth didn't end anything. It was the start of everything. When Christine finally spoke her truth in that quiet, vulnerable, sans resentment tone, something in her shifted, a bodily, cellular feeling. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a gentle unclenching, a release of something she hadn't realized she'd been gripping for years. The weight she had carried, the secret ache she had protected, the emotional suppression that had become second nature, all started to dissolve the moment her truth entered the air. She had dreaded that this revelation would break the family, but it broke her silence instead. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she didn't have to fold herself into smaller and smaller shapes just to fit into an emotional space that had never been made for her. It didn't tank once she spoke. In some ways, it opened up. She began to notice the small things first, the quiet relief in her breathing, the absence of tension in her shoulders, the way her reflection looked a little less burdened in the mirror. It wasn't happiness yet, but it was possibility. And possibility, after years of emotional scarcity, felt like oxygen. What the children's reaction meant to her was more than she could ever say. They didn't question her or ask her why she had stayed silent for so long. They did not blame her. Instead, they stepped closer to her, not literally, but emotionally. They saw her not as the endlessly strong mother who can carry anything, but as a human being who had carried far too much. They hugged her longer. They listened with more attention. They spoke with her in that tenderness born from understanding, not obligation. Their support wasn't loud or performative. It was steady. And steady was exactly what Christine needed at that moment in her life. For years, she had tailored her actions on principles to keep the family together. She had put the emotional security of others above her needs. She convinced herself that keeping quiet and suffering was a form of loyalty. Yet her children's acceptance showed her what she had never had the courage to believe. Her honesty didn't break her children. It strengthened them. Because kids don't learn resilience from watching a parent stay silent. They learn from watching a parent choose truth. As days went by, weeks followed. Christine's inner world started rebuilding itself. The fear that had paralyzed her now became a muffled echo. She began to recognize fragments of herself that she had forgotten. The one who laughed freely, the one who loved openly, the one who dreamed without inhibitions. She realized she hadn't lost those pieces. They had simply been waiting for space. Her relationships with her children were deeper because they were based on something new, transparency. She didn't hide it anymore. She didn't pretend to be unshakable. She let herself be human in front of them, and in return they offered empathy, not pressure. Christine also began to redefine what love meant to her. For so long she had accepted emotional crumbs and called it enough. She had equated endurance with devotion. She had mistaken suppressed pain for strength. But now, as she honored her own feelings, she realized love should not require disappearing. It should not demand silence. It should not feel conditional. Love, she learned, isn't measured by how much you can tolerate. It's measured by how seen you feel. And for the first time in years, she felt seen, if only by herself and her children.
It was enough. Her decision to rebuild her life didn't come from rebellion. It didn't come from anger. It came from peace. A peace that grew slowly, like sunlight spreading across a room that had been dark for too long. She wasn't running away from her past. She was walking toward her future. A future where she could breathe without fear of disappointing anyone. A future where she could speak without hesitating. A future where she no longer had to justify her emotional needs. Her truth became the foundation for all that would follow. It guided her choices. It restored her confidence. It opened her heart to possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. She learned that clarity is not cruel. It is kind. It reminded her that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is admit they deserve more. As Christine rebuilt her life, step by step steady, her children watched her glow in a way they never had. She smiled differently. She laughed more often. She walked with a lighter stride. They saw bits of joy returning to her in small glimmers, then in bright waves, and each wave reaffirmed what they already knew. Their mother had found herself again. Her truth didn't end her story. It restarted it. This time, Christine wasn't waiting for permission to feel worthy. She wasn't trying to cram herself into a mold that made her spirit painfully small. She wasn't waiting for any person to choose her. She was choosing herself. And in choosing herself, she taught her children the most powerful lesson of all. Silence can protect a family's image, but the truth keeps a person's soul intact. Her journey became a testament to the strength of honesty, courage it takes to speak after years of holding everything inside, and to the quiet power of a woman who finally understands her worth. Christine didn't reveal her truth to break the family up. She had shared it to rebuild herself. And in doing so, she found a version of life where she was no longer surviving. She was dwelling.